Greetings and salutations, fellow questioners. I am Jason McLean, and as always, we have my compatriot, Donny Cho. Today,
Hi.
we're going to talk about the Bronze Age collapse. It's going to be the first part of at least a two-part series because this is actually a subject we both care about, and we've wanted to do it for a while. And part two, we're going to get into like the Antikythera device, but part one is going to be explaining what the Bronze Age collapse was, when it happened, how bad was it? Because this is one of those subjects that doesn't really get approached a lot. And like I said, when Donnie first joined the show, he's like, this is something we got to talk about. And so here we are talking about it. Donnie, before we get too far, can you let people know that you finally have a show? Your own
Yes,
channel
I have my own channel and my own show. It's called Donny Cho Says Stuff, where I and sometimes with guests will go on and talk about stuff.
now.
Sometimes paranormal, sometimes pop culture. A couple things I do have to warn people about. It's not going to be 100% paranormal topics because I know we do have a lot of people following us from those previous
Yep.
paranormal shows. There will be some, but not 100%. So, yeah, I do have to apologize in advance if people are coming into these shows expecting paranormal Bigfoot talk, and then we just sit there and talk about some pop culture topic. So there's that. And the other warning I do have to give is that there will be foul language.
Yes.
It is not for kids.
No, it is not. It is not for
I
children.
don't want kids watching my show. So
yeah, no. Donnie's got a bit of a potty mouth from time to time. Honestly, I spend a lot of time crying in my sock drawer over some. I mean, I grew up as a mechanic, and I thought I'd heard it all. Then Donnie starts talking.
It's a little much for Jason's Christian ears, but
my virgin ears. Oh no, I grew up a mechanic, and I can't even believe what I'm hearing. Yes,
but yes,
it's terrible, awful.
But yeah, it's called Donny Cho Says Stuff. You could just put it in your search engine, or just click on my name
or follow
in the chats,
the links below,
or follow the links. It's all right there. And it's a similar format like this. We're doing it. I'm doing it the same way Jason's doing it on this show because I was originally going to do it just lives, but I kind of like this format. I'm starting to prefer this better, where it's pre-recorded but live streaming, because I find that that's actually more interactive with people in the chats if I'm actually in the chats.
Yeah.
So just keep your eyes open for that, folks.
So, Bronze Age collapse. And again, this is Donnie's really been hot on this one for a while, so I'm going to let him do a lot of the talking this episode. Donnie, what is the Bronze Age collapse? When did it occur? And where did it occur?
So, I guess it had obviously occurred around the Bronze Age in the area that best described, I would say, the parts where the Mediterranean touches land. Generally, the Near East, the ancient world in that time. You got Greece to the northwest. You got what's now Turkey up in the north, extending down through what we now call the Near East and the Levant, the Holy Land, all the way down to Egypt. That whole area during the Bronze Age basically experienced a total apocalypse. A total meltdown of society. That a couple things I wanted to mention about this topic. First and foremost, Jason, I think you and I need to define what the Bronze Age actually was.
Yes.
Compared to what we call the Iron Age or the Classical Age.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So the Bronze Age is actually a very long period of time. And this event takes place in the late Bronze Age, sometime between around 1200 BC to about 1150. Like this was a substantial period of time that these events that we're about to discuss take place. But the Bronze Age essentially is, and when we get to the Antikythera device, I think we can get a little bit more in detail on this. I'm not a fan of the term Bronze Age, but I understand why it's used, and so I'm okay with using it. But essentially, you have the Neolithic period where everything's made out of stone. Then you have the Copper Age where all of the artifacts we find are made out of copper. But then you have the Bronze Age where everything's made out of bronze. And then you have the Iron Age where, oh look, We have iron tools and weapons being used. Um, when you get to, honestly, about the period that we should be thinking of with the late Bronze Age is essentially the period when the Hebrew are in, they haven't gone into the Levant yet. They are out in the wilderness. They're, and then moving into the Levant. That's about the time frame that we're talking. That's after the Bronze Age collapse. So that's how far back we're talking about here. But we are talking about a large period of time. When you think of the New Testament, that is a late Iron Age section, and that tends to be the period that everyone thinks about. And Donnie, you make a great point on this, that the Iron Age and that sort of later period, we tend to think of it as more advanced than the earlier Bronze Age. And that's not really entirely accurate in a lot of ways. What are your thoughts on that?
So so I defined the Bronze Age as basically when we got out of the Stone Age, the Neolithic era, and basically we went from hunter-gatherer societies to now we have more agrarian cultures, more settlements, more cities, more societies that we envision how ours would look today, where you had general infrastructure and complex political and economic systems. The reason why it was called the Bronze Age was because, see, a lot of people think Bronze Age, they think, oh, they had bronze swords, and then Iron Age is, oh, they had iron swords. It didn't quite, not really. The advent of bronze was a big deal in a lot of different facets of life. They applied bronze not just to weapons, but also to farming equipment, for example, which greatly revolutionized some of their agricultural practices. They were able to increase food production. The advent of bronze also, not just militarily, but also like engineering and architecture, construction. It affected a whole sorts of facets of life. So that's the first thing I wanted to, that's the first myth I wanted to dispel, was that bronze and iron just meant swords or blades. It was more than that. Go ahead.
Well, and a good comment on that, sort of to expand on that idea for just a quick second. There is evidence of iron being used in the quote unquote Bronze Age, right? It is. But a lot of, and again, we'll get more into this when I'm talking about the Antikythera device, but the thing about bronze is it is a metal alloy of copper and tin, and it is very easily manipulated as opposed to iron. So if it's not like a big deal, you could use bronze. Honestly, probably 7 times out of 10, it's a perfectly useful metal for what they were doing at the time. And it would be cheaper and easier to manufacture than iron. The thing about iron is it takes obviously there's a lot of heat involved, and then shaping it beyond turning it into steel. Forget steel, just iron. It's really hard to use with certain levels of technology. So bronze is in many ways cheaper and easier to produce than iron. And for their level of technology, it's really the most useful material that you can have. And one of the reasons we don't have a lot of iron from that period, iron rusts, bronze doesn't. Like this is, again, I don't want to get too far afield, but I think one of the reasons we don't see as many iron or relics of iron tools from that time frame is they've literally gone away. They've rusted into nothing. Really, like I said, the delineation between bronze and iron is sort of it's a bit arbitrary, but the simple fact of the matter is bronze was a very useful tool. And the thing is, we see it being used in very sophisticated manners very early.
Yeah.
There's a lot of assumptions by archaeologists as how bronze was used was, oh, it's easier to pour. And no. We see them doing very sophisticated hammering techniques with bronze tools and helmets and things very, very early on. So this was not in many ways, this was not a very primitive people that were utilizing these things. These were very advanced tools that were being used and very advanced techniques being used. This was not a more primitive age. In many cases, you could argue that these later the New Testament period had was probably not as advanced in certain ways because of the information lost during this Bronze Age collapse, which again, late Bronze Age is around 1200 to 1150 BC. I'm not saying BCE, screw you for that. But like around that time frame, and truth be told, you could probably push it a little bit earlier than that and a little bit later as well. Like you could
Do you
widen that.
say AD or do you say CE?
I say AD.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah. People keep trying to push CE on me. I'm like, man, it's AD. Come on, get out of here.
Yeah. No. I'm not taking that crap.
No. Anyway.
So anyway, Bronze Age essentially is when bronze. It is a time frame when you have massive city states that are. There's a lot of international trade. People are trading all over the place. They're going everywhere. This is a time of a lot of opulence and a lot of power, both militarily and politically. And these are these massive city states that we tend to think of. And bronze is the fuel for this development and this enrichment.
I like to point to people that the Bronze Age was the first real time in known history that we saw a global economy.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, societies were isolated from one another. But the Bronze Age saw a level of opulence brought about because there was international trade. Probably even more expansive than what we saw with the Roman Empire at its height. This was advanced level. So one of the other myths that I feel like I need to dispel is that people think that as history progresses, things get more advanced, right? There was the medieval era, and then after that we had the Renaissance, which is more advanced in the medieval era, and then we had like the Victorian era, which was even more advanced than that, and going into the modern age. As time progresses, societies and technology get more advanced. That's actually a myth. And one of the biggest, and the history is filled with examples of this. The most common one people like to reference is the fall of Rome. That's the one societal collapse people like to reference all the time. Oh, back when Rome fell, right? So think about it like this. After Rome fell, what happens? What do we call that era immediately after? We call it the Dark Age, right? And why do we call it the Dark Age? Because society and all its infrastructure was gone. People, like, literacy was down.
That's a bit of a myth.
Down.
Real quick, that's actually that's a huge myth. It's this is one of those things where people talk about literacy. Again, literacy above 50% of the population is a recent thing.
Yeah.
The thing is, there wasn't all of our records are in Latin, which was the language of the educated. So they considered anyone who couldn't read Latin to be illiterate. The Germans, the French, the Spanish, everyone
that's the
had
only language that counts. Jason McLean.
Exactly. Like if you don't speak English today, you might as well you may as well not exist. Like you clearly are uneducated.
Those Germans might as well be grunting to one another.
And they probably are. But yeah, I mean, the simple fact of the matter is is that literacy was actually much higher than people give it credit for during that time frame. The problem is it was in the local languages. So as far as the aristocrats were concerned, everyone was illiterate, right?
Yeah.
So but to your point, there isn't a lot of the Dark Ages was a period of economic collapse where you had feudal states going at each other. There wasn't this sort of unified governmental structure.
Another famous example I like to point to after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, people not too long after that, people in Europe were seeing all these Roman aqueducts and bridges and engineering structures. And some of them actually postulated that giants might have built them because they had no clue how human beings could have constructed such an item. Just a few hundred years later, because the collapse of the Roman society had been, at least in the West, so complete.
Yeah.
So my point is, history doesn't always. It's more akin to like a bunny hops, where it's like three steps forward, two steps back. Where Rome at its height collapses. And by the way, I find it funny people reference the collapse of Rome, but no one can actually give a date.
Yep.
Or no one can point to a single thing or a single event that caused it. Some people may think that it was the sacking of Rome by the Goths that was the collapse of Rome. But I'm like, is that really the cause of the collapse or more of a result of it?
Right. Well,
Right.
so this is okay. That's a great question, and it's a really interesting point because I think this is going to reply very much to the Bronze Age collapse as well, which is societies collapse not because of one thing on one date.
Mm-hmm.
These are periods of time where
I mean, sometimes they do.
problems. Some, I mean, unless
Sometimes,
a volcano
like
explodes,
Nineveh was like one
right?
specific thing, right? The Assyrians, but that's a completely different
Right.
example.
Yeah, but
Usually, yeah,
that's not a societal collapse in so much as it was a military conquering,
yeah, they got
right?
steamrolled. Yeah,
Or again, a volcano erupts, a la
yeah,
Pompeii,
yeah,
and destroy.
yeah.
Like, unless with the exceptions of those few times, when you talk about larger societal collapses like the Dark Ages, it's never one thing. It's a multitude of things compiling over a period of time,
Over a period of time. Yep.
and essentially the strength of a unified government is destroyed, and everyone goes back to their. It's like, look, we got to care for ourselves and our peoples, and essentially, what's the point of dying in a war or giving all your grain that to some head of state if he can't provide you the security and it's all economics, right?
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't go to work if they weren't giving me money that allowed me to buy food and a house and keep my family safe, right?
Yeah.
If tomorrow all the police everywhere said we're done, and the military said we're done, and there was no one to police and there was no one to keep us safe militarily, no one would pay taxes because there would be zero reason to do it.
Yeah.
Now, again, that sounds insane, but when we're talking about the Bronze Age collapse, we're kind of talking about that very thing essentially happening over a period of time. So,
And
yeah.
because again, people like to reference the collapse of Rome, which I think is a
Mm-hmm.
good equivalent of showing that these kinds of things happen in cycles, right? Society
Right.
reaches its peak, and then there's a decline, there's a collapse, there's a dark age. People try to figure out a new society, and they pick up the pieces, and they start
Something new to
over, and they
fuel and
rebuild.
push the,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
to
that's
push
how
the economy
society.
forward.
That's
Yeah.
how history has been, and it's always been that way. So yeah, this whole notion of like the Old Testament world being more advanced than the New Testament, or like the New Testament world being more advanced than the Old Testament world, people need to get that out of their heads because, okay, one statistic that I read was that compared to Jesus's era versus the Bronze Age,
Mm-hmm.
there was a greater percentage of the population living in urban environments in the Bronze Age than there were in the Classical Age of like the New Testament time.
Oh,
Yeah.
and again, we'll get way more into this in the next episode. But just so people understand what we're talking about as far as advancement, 10 is actually in many cases more important than the bronze for this period because again, without bronze you just have or without 10 you just have copper. You don't have bronze, but 10 is actually harder to find than bronze in this area. They were getting 10 from Britain. There was 10 being mined in Britain and shipped to the Mediterranean, to Egypt, to Greece. Again, classical Greece includes Turkey, right, in that sort of northern area. So you have Hittites using bronze that had 10 from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is the time of the Mycenaeans and their lavish and export. I mean,
we had the
again,
Minoans in Crete. We
yeah,
had the Hittites. Some people think Troy
yeah. This was
there. Yeah.
there. Yeah, like this is when Troy was active. So yeah, to your point, again, just to reiterate, this was very advanced. They were going to places like Britain for 10. These people were more advanced in a lot of respects. It wasn't that Britain wasn't being colonized by Rome at this period, but they were doing it earlier, and they were going in many cases further distances. And we'll allude to how far they were going here in a little in the next episode. But
Mm-hmm.
yes, in
I
many
was going to bring
ways,
that up, but I was like, nope, wait till episode 2. Wait till episode
episode
2.
2 is when is really going to drive home the idea that maybe there was a little bit more, and why there was maybe a little bit more advanced technology.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll address that next episode.
So the Bronze Age collapse, since the modern field and study of history even began, where we could, I mean, where would you say history as a discipline began? Maybe Herodotus?
Yeah, Herodotus. I think
Yeah.
that's a good one.
So from Herodotus up to this day, as long as the study of history has been around, people have been debating forever what caused the Bronze Age collapse. It is probably the greatest mystery in all of history, because so it happened, like you said, Jason, earlier, sometime between 1150 and 1200 BC is the most common dating I've come across.
Mm-hmm.
Some are more general. Some people say between 1100 and 1200 BC.
Yeah.
But largely the most common one I've heard is between 1150 and 1200. Something happened where one by one, starting from the north, city-states and these super powerful economic juggernauts, political and all this money and opulence and military power, all this infrastructure, all of these cities, one by one, started going dark, started going silent. We even have some writings from the Egyptians where they even talk back and forth. Hey, have you heard anything coming from the Hittites lately? No,
Yeah.
I haven't seen any merchants, no letters. What's been going on? And then a little bit further south, it continues where one by one, these cities, the lights get turned off.
Yep.
And for a modern equivalent, imagine like a zombie apocalypse breaking out, where it's like one by one, different cities, you stop hearing from them. And that's what happened. And it started slowly moving its way south, down through Anatolia, and Greece started going quiet. The eastern part of the Mediterranean, those cities were either going silent or completely destroyed or being abandoned. And it started creeping its way down all the way to Egypt. And this was Egypt when they were at their like peak.
This was peak Egypt.
And what happened, okay, I believe it was 1175 BC. Basically, when Egypt was at its peak, they had their own equivalent of a 9/11 happen, where this group of people got off on boats right at the Nile Delta and invaded their homelands. And at the time, Egypt was no stranger to war. They had all these military campaigns. Oh, yeah. They were all about that, especially with like the rivalries with like the Hittites and the Babylonians. They knew war, but they ain't never had their homeland straight up invaded by dudes on boats who were basically the ancient world's version of Vikings. Basically showed up in their lands and invaded. And it was one of the hardest fought wars in their memory. Ramses III wrote about it a lot. The Sea Peoples actually were defeated, and Ramses III talked about how he rounded them up and executed a bunch, exiled a bunch, and he did all sorts of things. So the Sea Peoples eventually failed, but the battle was so arduous and it was so damaging that even though the Egyptians won, their society would eventually collapse, a lot because of the result of the mortal wounds that they had received because of these military invasions on their own land, which at the time was unheard of.
Yes, absolutely. And this is from the Battle of the River Delta. This is Ramesses is obviously the giant guy over there on the right-hand side leading the army, facing off against what they call the Sea Peoples. And they call them the Sea Peoples.
That picture?
Yep.
Oh, nice.
So this is actually from the Western Wall at Medinet Habu. And again, that's Ramesses III, and they are fighting these Sea Peoples. And again, they call them the Sea Peoples because it wasn't just one group of people. It seemed to be a lot of different groups all over the place. Since you probably can't get a lot of good detail, I did get some closer images, but you'll notice some of these Sea Peoples have horned helmets.
Yep.
And they also had feathered crests and helmets that had feathers on them. But this is the massive fight over the Delta. And
Now,
yeah, it was massive.
now they themselves didn't call them the sea peoples. That word was given to them like by
Yeah.
more modern historians. The Egyptian writings, they actually describe them like they identified them as a whole bunch of individual tribes. It was basically, to them, they were a coalition of all these tribes. But we have a
Hmm.
hard time tracing who they were because the language was so weird
Yeah.
and some of the words were not used anymore. So we do have there is confusion as to who these people were. And there has been, and there still is a lot of debate going around as to who the sea
Yeah.
peoples actually were. I can tell
Real
you
quick,
one Oh, go ahead.
one quick one, because I know people are like, well, there were helmets with horns on them. They must have been actual Vikings. Put a pause in that. Viking helmets did not have horns.
No, they didn't.
They did not have horns. So put a nail in that one real fast. Now, could some of these people have been Germanic descent? Possibly. We literally have no idea.
We have no
But
idea.
yeah, I just want to be like, oh well, maybe they were Vikings. Stop. We that the helmets and the
That was
horns.
too long ago. The Vikings
Yeah.
are actually closer to us in time than they are to the Bronze Age.
Yes.
So,
So like the whole Cleopatra lived closer to the invention of the iPhone than she did the building of the pyramids.
yeah,
That's how much
much
time we're
much
talking about.
closer too.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So anyway, back to the who may
interesting
these sea peoples have been.
interesting little detail is that, okay, so these sea people invade. By the time they invade Egypt, pretty much everything north has just been gone. Now, and some of these cities were never inhabited ever again. So they were completely destroyed. And when we found some archaeological evidence of these cities or the ruins, they all seem to have a strange layer of ash. All of them. And around this layer of
Yes.
ash is a bunch of arrowheads and remnants of something really violent and catastrophic and sudden happening. And it's funny that they all seem to have this one layer of ash. A lot of these ancient cities that never recovered. I actually, in looking for stuff on the Bronze Age, actually came upon. I'm going to read this part now. A stone tablet or a clay tablet that was still in the kiln in a city that is no longer inhabited called Ugarit, which is located in northern Syria, discovered in the 1920s. And when they discovered it, this was one of those cities that was really powerful, really huge, and destroyed and never came back. They found this clay tablet written by the king to, I think he was sending it over to the neighboring king of Alesia, and it was an SOS. And here's how it reads after they've translated it. It says, "My father." By the way, father was a term of respect.
Yeah.
So he's not really talking about his actual father. It's just, my liege,
It's an honor. It's an honorific.
Yeah. "My father, behold, the enemy's ship came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Do not, my father, know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it, the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us," and then stop. That clay tablet was never finished. So this guy was basically sending an SOS, and the message was not sent out in time, and most likely died horribly.
Yeah. Wasn't that one even found in the kiln?
It was found in the kiln.
Yeah.
So
this is a clay tablet. This dude is because it's wet. He's making the impressions. He's writing, and he has to stop. He's like, okay, they're coming. Get this in the kiln so we can get this out. They couldn't even get it out of the kiln. That's how fast this occurred.
Now, so a lot of earlier historians, what they attributed as the cause of the Bronze Age collapse was, it's these sea peoples. It's all these tribes that gathered together and invaded all these people and destroyed all these cities. But there's one detail. In the Egyptian account, when they do describe the battles with the sea peoples, one of the things that they were very clear in their writings was that when the sea people showed up, they showed up with women and children. their
Yeah.
wives and their families. They showed up with their household goods. This isn't some conquering army trying to go out and invade for plunder and glory. These people were in desperation mode. Something had to have gone down that was serious in their homelands for them to do what they did.
This
Because
is essentially Battlestar Galactica, where you
yeah,
have
bringing your wives and your children with you,
that is not something you do. Not in
that
at
means
all.
things are not going well at home.
Okay, so this is a misnomer that people miss it. Like, just to put an emphasis on that idea, people think that the reason often have this idea that the reason the Vikings went Viking, right? Because the Viking means to go raiding. That the reason for the raiding part is because things must have been really bad in Scandinavia. No, they weren't. Military excursions to conquer cities, to gain. This is how you gained resources. That actually can only occur when you have a strong financial base, a
Yeah,
strong economic base.
yeah.
We're going to be doing a lot more videos on like economics in general, but please understand this: economics is not. I've seen people say, "Oh, economics is about rich people buying boats." No, that's astute. That is like one of the dumbest things you could ever possibly say. Economics is how people live. If you think about it, if you and your family are starving to death, how are you going to mount these big excursions to go get goods and things, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't do it. These people were not, to Donnie's very well stated point, if they're bringing their women and their children with them and their home goods, these are not people on raiding parties. These are people for whom they are escaping. These are refugees. That's what this is. These are refugees. And that does kind of change possibly what's happening in these environments. Because think about it, we only have the Egyptians accounts and the accounts from these few other areas. It's entirely possible, and this is kind of the next step I wanted to go. It's not just that there's this layer of ash that occurs at this time period everywhere. It's not
Like
just that.
dozens of cities.
Yeah, dozens
Yeah,
upon dozens of
yeah,
cities. Even within the cities, we find, particularly the ones that were abandoned, we do find destruction and ash very contained within palace areas. And they found pollen counts very, very low, like fossilized pollen counts dropped significantly during this period.
mm-hmm.
It appears that that probably due to some sort of a catastrophic environmental event. Essentially, you have crops failing everywhere and lack of rain. There's evidence that some of the plants in the Near East and
Yeah,
Africa and a few other places started to become more desert-like. They started
yeah,
adapting to less rain. It is entirely possible that you have a complete, again, lack of food leads to an economic collapse, and another thing leads to an economic collapse as well. We'll talk about that next week. But what you have is a complete economic collapse. So these city states were already in the process of being abandoned. People were in the process of going after the people who ran these city states. And so by the time these people show up, again, we don't know who they are, where they came from, but by the time they show up, it may be they're like, that they're starting to fight them off. It's like, well, uh, we can't absorb these other tribes of people. We can't even feed ourselves. We're starving to death as it is. And thus the conflict actually breaks out. These sea peoples, at least at first, may not have been raiding parties. They may have just been people, refugees looking for places to live and get food and set up shop. And the indigenous tribes and city states are like, we can't afford to have these people here. And thus it leads to the conflict. That's entirely possible. What this really was is
yeah.
that these sea peoples are not these barbarians, hell bent on destroying society. Society was collapsing, and they were just an event
And it
of
leads to the whole
migrants.
chicken and egg debate, right? Did the sea peoples, are they the chicken or the egg, right? Or did they
Mm-hmm.
cause the destruction, or were they the result of it? And
Yep.
there is evidence also of climate change, a natural disaster. They do believe that the period between 1100 and 1200 was like particularly very dry, and there were a lot
Yep.
more droughts. There was also evidence of a volcanic reaction, eruption on the island of Santorini that occurred around
Oh
this
yeah.
time, which
Oh,
could have caused tsunamis, which would have wiped out a whole navies, which is one of the reasons why they could have been so vulnerable to the sea peoples.
yep. And of course, again, Santorini didn't just erupt; it blew the freak up. It's like I wish I wish I'd pulled an image of Santorini. Let me see if I can pull it real quick, because Santorini today, like, this will give you an idea of how bad that was. But to your point, Santorini, there it is. It's in the Aegean Sea, and this is one of those things that a lot of people sort of miss. Let me see if I can Caldera. There it is. So at this time, right, what a lot of people miss is we lose a Greek language called Linear B. When we're talking about how bad this was from an economic standpoint, from a human standpoint, we lose an entire language at this time frame. That's how bad this is. And this is the caldera of the island of Santorini. People live there. This looks like an island, and it is. But here's the thing: that big piece in the middle, that is
Damn.
the caldera.
So
That is a
the volcano wasn't on the island of Santorini. It is the
it
island of
is
Santorini.
it is the island of Santorini, and essentially this was a much larger island prior to this explosion.
That must have been a bad
This
one.
It was catastrophic. Archaeologists have claimed that the explosion in Santorini is the explanation for the miracles, for many of the miracles that occur and are recorded in the book of Exodus. That the hail mixed with fire, the darkness, all of it. I don't buy that explanation, but that being said, that's how monumental this is, because this is Greece and we're talking about Egypt. That's how far away they were. And they're like, yeah, no, whatever happened in Santorini, this explosion could have potentially caused a lot of these events as far away as Egypt. So this was the nukes that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were infinitesimally small by comparison to Santorini. So yeah, it is entirely possible. Again, we have overall climate changes happening where it becomes drier. You have Santorini, to Donnie's point, wiping out whole navies, perhaps even whole coastal cities. I mean, and let's not forget about the debris that would have rained down. Their whole civilizations, a lot of people say the Mycenaeans ended because of Santorini. So again, we don't really know, but there seemed to be this other event that occurs. And then we start seeing this massive economic collapse, and it's so complete that you have these sea peoples. This something had to drive these numerous. It's not just like 1, 2, or 3, or 4 tribes, like dozens of different tribes together to brave the ocean and try and find some place to live. And then essentially everyone else is starving to death. So it just becomes fights. So these big wars of resources, but whole civilizations are just destroyed. City states collapse, everything. There's, like I said, the palaces that are destroyed. It is clear there was massive societal upheaval happening during this period. Again, so bad an entire language disappears. That was an active use. It's one thing to lose your Donnie, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I accidentally unplugged my mic.
Oh, gotcha.
But there were multiple, because I was like, why is Jason ignoring me? I was like, oh, I'm muted. Anyway, the other thing that was also especially precarious was the fact that because the trade routes were so expansive and extensive, these societies were totally reliant on these trade routes, meaning that these individual nations weren't self-sufficient at all. Now, if they were like of less complexity or less advancement and they were more isolated from one another, then they might have had the self-sufficiency to survive. But if you've got one city, for example, that's now completely reliant on this other city for this resource or for food, if that trade route breaks, then that creates a domino effect. That's the double-edged nature of a global economy, right? Before, you didn't have to worry about the other nation going down because your nation's over here, you're producing your own food. But now because they have a global economy, what happens over there now affects me over here.
Yep. Huh. Donald, perhaps you have thought about this or not. I certainly wouldn't know. But that seems to have a really interesting ring of recent events, doesn't it?
I think it does. Because I don't know, because
Interesting.
I think most of our audience, it's safe to assume, is American. So
probably
it's
most of
fair
them.
enough that a lot of people wouldn't be paying attention to some of the stuff that's going on in China. But for those of you who may not have been following, there have been things going on in China ever since 2020 after a certain event that we're not going to mention because the YouTube overlords don't like us mentioning it. So instead, I will use a code word, and that code word is unicorn.
The unicorn event.
When the unicorn was doing its thing and going around China back in 2020, I was watching that news. As a matter of fact, Jason, I remember distinctly on New Year's Eve, going from 2019 to 2020, I was with my friends in North Carolina. We were having like a dinner and a party. It was a small gathering of close friends.
Yeah.
And during that dinner, I told my friends, hey guys, there's this unicorn going around over in China that I think it's going to be the big one. And at the time, they didn't believe me. They didn't
Who
believe
could
me.
never believe, who would ever doubt the great Donnie Cho?
And then a few months later, I believe in like February, March, the unicorn came to town. And I was just going around saying, I told you so.
Yep.
So
my wife, who was doing tutoring in China remotely during the 2019,
yeah,
that's one thing she was talking about. She's like, I'm hearing these weird things about unicorns happening happening in China. She's like, should I tell somebody? I'm like, I looked at my wife. I'm like, honey, I imagine somebody already knows about this. Now, in retrospect, maybe she should have said. Maybe I should have taken that a little, taken that a little bit more. I didn't really have shows at that time, so
now
it is what it is. But still,
the reason why I think this is so relevant to our topic of discussion, because if you're following the news of what's going on in China nowadays,
yes,
they're basically experiencing an entire, fully comprehensive societal collapse right now. Right now, there are banks that are freezing people's assets. You have throngs of people protesting outside of banks because they can't access their funds. The real estate bubble has popped. You have Shanghai, one of the most advanced and one of the most populous cities in China, is experiencing its first waves of population decline. In Shanghai, that's unheard of.
Yep.
I don't know if people are aware, but Foxconn got out of Dodge. Samsung and all those factories got out of Dodge. They're all moving their operations over to places like Vietnam and Mexico.
Yeah.
You have entire companies that are shuttering. Alibaba got taken apart. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. Alibaba got dissected by the Chinese government.
Part of that was political, but here's the thing. To your broader point, which is important, it's never one thing, but societal collapse is going to showcase its way in a lot of different ways. the breaking up of Alibaba was because the owner and founder was too powerful politically because
Mhm.
of Alibaba. So that's why.
Yeah.
So it was weakness. It was political weakness from Xi Jinping is why they had to do it. And to your
I think
point,
that guy's still in hiding now too. Jack
yeah, oh
Ma.
yeah, he's
Yeah.
well. Last I heard, he's still in hiding. At least again, last I heard, but who knows? Maybe they Epsteined
Yeah.
him. But yeah, point being, dude disappeared, and they cut up Alibaba like it was you know a high school science
Yeah.
experiment frog.
Basically, they got themselves in lockdown because of the unicorn, and it was a total and complete lockdown. Not like here,
Mhm.
like they got locked down. And
People
then
were
once,
welded inside their apartment complexes.
yeah, and the Chinese government was like, "This will solve the unicorn," and then eventually the unicorn kind of leaves, and then they lift the lockdown. But guess what? The economy doesn't recover. Well, what do
Well,
you know?
exactly.
Now
Well,
all
here's
these
the
people
thing.
are defaulting on their debts.
Well, the economy was fake in many ways was fake to begin with. See,
Yeah,
this is where again, it's not an ecological situation that's creating the problem in China. It's the fact that their economy was always fake, like these ghost cities where people were.
ghost cities. I was about to mention that. Yeah.
Yeah, like this is one of those things people don't understand. Our news media was praising China for their look at how they're building these cities for future. It's like no, they're not. They're doing it because they need to keep people busy and they need to pretend that they have an economy.
And then these
That's the
construction
problem.
companies build up too much debt. They run out of
Mhm.
resources and they have all these cities of these giant, massive buildings that are unfinished. And you have
Yep.
a lot of home buyers who have bought homes before the home was even constructed. And now the construction company and the real estate company have gone belly up. But these people still got mortgages to pay and their homes aren't
Yep.
finished yet.
Mhm.
It's a messed up situation going on in China
It's
right now.
jacked.
And a lot of people would say, well, it was because of the unicorn. Was it though? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, it definitely had a part to play for sure, but these
it didn't help.
problems were more endemic and systematic that were going
Mhm.
back before the unicorn. Now, the unicorn definitely kicked it up.
Yeah. Well, the unicorn essentially just exacerbated the pre-existing conditions so much they couldn't recover. Like again, going back to the idea of the sea peoples, a lot of archaeologists and historians have said, guys, yeah, the sea peoples are a big deal, but they were not an existential threat to any of these nations at all. They just weren't. So how is it that everything's again to your point of why people used to claim the sea peoples just destroyed everything? It's like they shouldn't have been able to though. That's the point. These were not the sea peoples were not an existential threat to these nations. However, if you have all these other problems, now it becomes an existential crisis.
Hmm. Now it becomes a domino effect.
Yep. It's just, and again, as we mentioned, it's entirely possible the sea peoples themselves were just a domino. They were the victims of this larger societal collapse. And in many ways, they're probably like just the last manifestation of this collapse. These migrating refugees. All right, I'm going to say this very carefully. Migrating refugees looking for resources in areas that, let's be honest, they couldn't build, and many of them probably couldn't understand the technology that got them there in the first place. So they're just raiding because it's all they have left. Again, doesn't sound all that unfamiliar to what's going on in Europe either, or California to Texas. Look, I never had an opinion about Californians until the last couple of years when they all decided to move here. I got nothing but love for people, and then y'all came here, and in my love of Californians has greatly diminished because of the bull crap that's happening here in Texas because they all decided to move here. I'm sorry, raccoons are not a threat to you. Stop it. Jeez.
Did you
And
tell that story on this show?
I I think I have. And well, I think it was before
Why
we
don't you
got our
tell
own
it real
channel.
quick? Why don't you enlighten
Okay.
the folks real quick?
All right.
This is your equivalent of sea peoples. This is your
My
sea
equivalent of sea
peoples.
peoples.
Yeah.
Yes, my equivalent of the sea peoples are the Californians. They are calling the police in wasting the time of police officers, animal control over things like raccoons and bobcats being in their backyard. Lady, you live in Waxahachie, Texas. Leave it. Like, what am I supposed to do? Leave it the hell alone. It's gonna go away. You live in the country now. It's not a mountain lion trying to break into your home. It is a freaking bobcat it's a raccoon. Leave it alone. Give it a dog biscuit. I don't care. Why are you wasting our time on this? Why are you complaining that people need to get the raccoon population under control? Like, the complaints
Californians,
about
man.
grills. The complaints about grills. I have neighbors that have this is a very nice, very expensive grill setup. They have nice sort of patio furniture they keep in the driveway because they are entertaining. What I mean all the time, I mean multiple times a week. They are out. That dude's out there grilling. This is a nice setup. And they are complaining to the city all the time because, like, well, I don't want that grill out there. You came here because you turned California into a hellhole. Shut up. You came here for a reason. Elon Musk, builder of electric cars. By the way, I'm going to do a whole series on why I think electric cars are terrible ideas. So this is not me saying I love Elon Musk because he makes green energy. I don't think green energy is green. That's a different conversation. I'm just saying I ain't got a whole lot of love for him overall. But he freaking moved here because he had to move here because he was having trouble building these green cars in California, a state that is claiming they want to end the sale of gasoline powered cars in under a decade. And businesses are fleeing. People are fleeing California because of what y'all are doing. Y'all are sea peoples. Leave our raccoons and grills alone.
You're like Egypt.
They're
like leave our Nile Delta alone, you sea
leave
peoples.
our Nile Delta alone.
Oh, Jason, I knew you were Ramses the Third and reincarnated.
Hold on. Nope, wrong one. I see the resemblance.
Yeah.
Now, the sea peoples did have some interesting sets of technology, though, like the bows. They use compound or they use composite bows instead of the longer bows. So there were some, like, these sea peoples were not necessarily they weren't just a bunch of total barbarians. They apparently had some interesting technology on their side as well. But the simple fact of the matter is, these were clearly refugees. These were not some raiding. This was not a raiding party sent by some eager conqueror. These were refugees from some place that had failed completely.
I've heard so many different theories on who some of these sea people were.
Like California.
I've heard theories of the Philistines in the Bible.
Yeah,
being of the sea peoples.
Yeah, a descendant of the sea peoples. Yes,
I've heard theories of the Trojan War.
Yeah,
those Greeks that were invading Troy, they were amongst the sea peoples. That's not the same ancient Greeks as we know the ancient Greeks. That was more of like a proto-Greek society.
Yeah.
But they think that whole Trojan War was an account of an invasion of sea peoples. Some people have said, yeah, there were some battles in the Bible that they think may have been an invasion of the sea peoples, and these were events that were taking place during the Bronze Age collapse as they happened.
Yeah,
I don't know. Do you see a lot of evidence in the Bronze Age collapse in the Bible or in the biblical account?
Well, so again, a lot of it depends on when a lot of these things occur. I think you could argue that the famines that are often described, particularly in Genesis, right, where they end up in Egypt ultimately, you could argue a lot of those famines are essentially memories of the larger ecological collapse that was occurring during that period. Because we have to remember, Abraham was like early to mid Bronze Age.
Yeah.
He wasn't.
And
So yeah, a lot of people have speculated that the Bronze Age the late Bronze Age collapse does sort of tie into the Hebrews leaving Egypt in some way.
some people have even theorized that the Hebrews and the Israelites were some of the same peoples. I don't know if you've
Could
heard
be.
those theories.
I have. Yeah, no, I have, because there are several accounts. A lot of archaeologists aren't. No, actually, a lot of archaeologists don't even really want to talk about the Hebrew or the ancient Israelites in general, but that's a whole other conversation. I don't think they were necessarily the sea people, but the thing is, they may have been they may have already been in Egypt during that time frame, right? They may have been a part of that event. So there is some questions as to when does the Exodus actually occur, right? Does it occur before this? Does it occur after this? But it does seem to occur within that time frame. So it's possible that they are, the Egyptians, as far as they concerned, they may have chalked them up as one of the sea peoples, even though they were there before these
Or
invasions.
maybe it occurred as a part of it.
Yeah, or it was a part of it. Again, they left, again, the events of the Exodus, they leave, which is why Egypt is as completely economically demolished by the time the sea people show up. And essentially it's over. Like, this is why, Egypt never really recovers from this. That's the thing we need to remember. In a lot of ways, Egypt never recovers from this
No, they never
this
recover.
collapse.
Yeah. No, I meant
There's
it
a
when I
reason
said
why
this was like their 9/11.
Yeah. I mean,
Because
Egypt,
it totally shook the society to its core.
yeah, Egypt would remain powerful for centuries, but it was never more than a third-rate power after this collapse. And it's entirely possible that the events of Exodus are was the setup. So when the sea peoples do eventually show up, it's like, okay, we just can't recover from this financially, which is why they were conquered by the Greeks, which is why they were conquered by the Romans, right? Yes, they would remain powerful for a long time, but if you were to compare, late Bronze Age, post collapse, and Iron Age Egypt versus before the Bronze Age collapse, early Bronze Age Egypt would wipe the floor with Iron Age Egypt. Like, not even a question.
So a lot of people have to consider that after the Bronze Age collapse, that was their equivalent of the Dark Age. That was Mad Max, post-apocalyptic. That's a lot of like the later part of the Old Testament is that Mad Max era where they're trying to pick up the pieces and recover.
Joshua,
you guys have to,
the events of Joshua, the events of the judges, like those periods, that is absolutely post Bronze Age collapse. So to your point, they're very much the Bronze Age collapse happened at just the right time for them, for the Israelites to thrive. Because coincidence and all. But the tribes that they are fighting, that you see again throughout the Old Testament, where they're coming in and raiding the Israelites for goods and stuff, that's exactly what the sea peoples were doing. So to your point, is there a connection? Yes, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing those, even though it's post the collapse, the economy never really doesn't recover for centuries. So we see these tribes doing the exact same thing the sea peoples were doing. And that's what it's documenting.
Like Nebuchadnezzar, that was post collapse.
Yeah.
All that stuff. Alexander the Great, that's post collapse.
Yep.
And you gotta, people have to have a tendency to like lump eras together when they're not like very learned in history. So
well, there's a lot of periods, and it is kind of hard to keep a lot of this in your mind if you don't study it. And the thing is, what's happening over here doesn't necessarily apply to what's happening over here, because like what's going on in Asia at this time, right? It's like, do they suffer from the same events of this?
They're probably feeling the effects because if they're trade partners, major trade partners.
That's true. Yep, 100%. So yeah, again, this was a collapse, a complete societal collapse in a way that it does take centuries to grow out of. Like you said, this is their dark ages. And you could argue for them, it really doesn't end until you get Alexander the Great bopping around. There's an argument to be made that he's...
There's that argument to be made.
That he... But but also in a way it never really recovers until today. It's
I would
hard.
I would argue they probably start recovering. I would put it at once the Persian Empire starts. I would
I'll
put
give
it
that to
there.
you.
I would put it there.
I'll give it to you. However, the thing is, by the time you get, even with the Persian Empire, you never have the large global unified, even under Rome. Like everyone seems to imagine Rome conquering everything. It only hugged the Mediterranean. Like it did get
Yeah.
further into Europe, absolutely, but it only hugged the Mediterranean. You don't really get the broader worldwide empires, and I mean empire economically.
Yeah.
Right, not militarily, but economically, until you get to the British Empire.
And there's evidence of Bronze Age era peoples trading with. Yeah, we'll get there.
We'll save that one. Yeah, again, we'll save that one for next time. So that's the Bronze Age collapse. Donnie, we're an hour into this.
Mm-hmm.
How would you sum up the Bronze Age collapse? So people are like, well, so what's my main? What are my main takeaways? How do we sum this up? What do we do with it?
It was the end of the world. It was Armageddon. It happened. And after Armageddon, just like any kind of post-apocalyptic movie, things went Mad Max.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened to Rome, that was a lesser version, a less complete version or absolute version than what happened in the Bronze Age. And that is the time when the world ended and nobody talks about it. Not these days.
Are there any takeaways that we should have for, say, today's society?
I'll let you handle that one, Jason, but there's a lot that can be said and a lot that can be seen with what went down then with what's going on now in some places. So
I would say my main takeaway is that every nation should be a lot more self-sufficient than it is. Because if you set yourself up to be too dependent on global trade, then if you have a problem over here and it's bad enough, it could be a problem everywhere. And if enough dominoes fall, then it's, to your point, the end of everything. Well, this was fun. It was. Hey, we got to see cool rock carvings of sea peoples and realize how much I look like Ramesses III. I think it's a successful video. So, guys, go over, follow the links. You can go check out Donnie Cho Says Stuff. You may even see me talking about stuff from time to time over there. And like, follow, subscribe, share us out, and we will catch you next time.